Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.
Following previous co-productions of Night of the Living Dead Remix and Dracula the Untold Story, theatre company Imitating the Dog is again collaborating with Leeds Playhouse, this time on a new adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The production is created by Imitating the Dog co-artistic directors Pete Brooks, Andrew Quick and Simon Wainwright. I spoke to Andrew Quick during rehearsals at Leeds Playhouse and asked him why Frankenstein and why now?
Why Frankenstein? What a great question. Well, I think Frankenstein's a really amazing novel, and it's never really left our kind of consciousness. You know, it's never really left the landscape. It's always being reinvented. It's always being tackled. I mean, we've got Poor Things out at the moment, which is a kind of version of Frankenstein. So I think in our sort of landscape, it's one of those texts that's been on the back burner, and we've obviously done quite a lot of Gothic themed adaptations. So it did feel like a sort of natural follow-on from Dracula, then doing Macbeth, which wasn't particularly Gothic-y, but it definitely had that element to it, to come to Frankenstein. So it's a text we've been interested in. And what interests us in the text is the multiple things, really. There's the theme of kind of creation, bringing life out of death, as it were, because that's sort of what drives Victor Frankenstein to create the creature. The rejection of the human being that's born into a world that doesn't accept him. And he wants this love, he wants this sort of acceptance into society, and he's rejected at every turn. That felt like, oh yes, this sort of acceptance and rejection and this dealing with the other, this kind of stranger, this outsider. But it's still human, but we don't really recognize it. So the theme of love is something that's definitely we're bringing out. And then the other kind of notion that we've been exploring is, I suppose, what its responsibility, what it's like at the moment when the world feels quite a fragile place, what it's like to deal with the possibility of bringing something into the world, and whether it's a good time, whether it's appropriate. But since there are so many humans, and since, you know, we're putting such stress on our natural resources and the planet. So we've got kind of two threads here. We've got the story from the novel, and we've got a story of a young couple grappling with the sort of reality and the sort of moral problem of what it might be like to have a child and bring a child into the world. Right. So we've got a mod version, and then we've got underneath it, underscoring it and kind of threading its way through, is this story from the novel.
Yeah, and you've only got two in the cast. Do you want to just explain how that works, what your approach is to it?
Yeah, well, they're basically, we've got, I mean, it's interesting, the novel, because it's often encounters between two people. So you've got Walton and Victor Frankenstein. You know, if you know the novel, Victor Frankenstein ends up in the Arctic, and he's kind of telling his story to this ship's captain called Robert Walton, I think his name is. So we've got Robert Walton and Victor Frankenstein as a kind of conversation. We've got obviously the confrontations between the creature and Victor Frankenstein, which is a very big part of the novel. And various other conversations that Victor Frankenstein has, or encounters with, like Elizabeth or his father. So weirdly, it does work as a set of dialogues between two people. And then we've got the couple. There are moments where it's quite difficult to kind of capture the whole kind of chaos of, but we kind of said a lot of it on the ship in the conversation. And that's not often done. So I've kind of held to that narrative structure of the novel. It gives me a kind of, what I like about the ship is it's a tight, closed world. They're trapped in the ice, and the ice is tightening, and nature's kind of forcing this story out of the characters. And the couple are in this flat, you know, in a big city somewhere, and the world is kind of tightening around them as well. So I've tried to keep these parallels in place. So the claustrophobia of two people and the necessity of two people to kind of talk it out and fight it out feels like an appropriate structure.
Yeah. In a sense, that mirrors how the story came about in the first place, the famous story of how they were trapped and they were telling each other stories with Mary Shelley and Byron. So you're sort of taking that structure as well, and there are echoes right down the line, really, for that, aren't they?
Yes, that's a really good point, actually. And you know what? When I did the research on how the novel was written, remember, it's Mary Shelley's like 17, 18. To write a novel at that age with such complexity and such confidence shows you what an amazing woman she was. But, you know, they were writing, you're right, they were having these sort of stories, horror story, ghost story sessions whilst a volcano had exploded. So, you know, the natural world was full of storm and full of rain, and there wasn't much sunlight. So it did really feel like they were trapped in this sort of big house on the edge of a lake, you know, with nature kind of shuddering around them. Yeah. So I've kind of tried to capture that as an echo in the script, but also visually. There's a lot of visual, because we use projection. There are no live cameras in this show, which is, you know, perhaps with just two people, a godsend, to be honest. But it's creating a more visual landscape, not for the camera or for the screen, but more for the audience as a larger picture, as it were.
So can you explain something about the staging? What makes this into a Imitating the Dog production? What are the production aesthetics, I suppose?
Well, I think people will see it very much like Imitating the Dog show, but it won't have the live cameras. And the live cameras, look, they're great, but they do force you always into a particular direction and a particular relationship with both the technology and the performer, because you're always having to choreograph action to camera and to backdrop to create the sort of live cinema. Yeah. Which, to be honest, is great, but it is sometimes exhausting because you sometimes feel theatrically constrained. And that does create a kind of interesting limit to what you do. But I think we wanted, there are all sorts of reasons why we've only got two people. And part of it is budget, to be honest, because things are tight now in the industry, as you probably know, and costs have gone up. I mean, I'm not saying that as a complaint because it offers you great opportunities. So I see it as a challenge rather than as a limitation. But what we're trying to do is create the kind of visual excitement of an Imitating the Dog show, of creating images, of creating this sort of visual landscape in which a complex story can be kind of untangled. So we've got projection. We've got this very lovely kind of almost like widescreen set, which is a room which you can project into. I don't want to spoil it too much, but within the projection world, what look like kind of objects that you might have in a flat turn into screens. And those screens bring a kind of visual life to the space. So, you know, Victor Frankenstein, while talking about a kind of how he scientifically made his journey from working with dead matter to creating life, he can touch one of these screens and electricity can go through it and then something can come to life. So you've got these objects that have a utility within the space, but also a kind of metaphorical life of helping us to tell stories. And I think the video designer, Simon Wainwright and Haley Gritton, they've done a really great job on the design of creating these kind of, within this house space of these sort of portrait or rectangular apertures, which you can use almost as picture frames. And then you can make the whole space like a blizzard.
Yeah.
You know, you can have, or it can all start melting, or it can become ice and it can crack.
All of that's quite magical when it comes together. But, you know, the tradition in theatre is that you don't see the set quite often until Tech Week. I'd imagine that wouldn't really work very well with you because all of this is integrated so well into the action. You'd need something in rehearsals, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's if you were watching what we did this morning, we were actually teching, exploring, staging all at the same time. So, I mean, one of the reasons that our process is quite expensive is we've got, you know, a composer, James Hamilton, he's making the music live in the space with his instruments, and he's a bit like Rick Wakeman in a Yes thing. He's got all these things around him, and he can build the sonic world. We've got Rory, who's creating the Foley, gunshots or cracking of ice. I've got a lighting designer who's giving me lights. I've got Simon and Davi, the video assistant, bringing video material. So there's a lot more people back off the stage than on the stage. And I'm like, you know, trying to keep it all under control. And it's not always easy. But I think we're doing that exploration thing at the moment and creating and kind of sculpting. And then, you know, at the end of next week, we've got one more week after that, really it'll be finessing and stabilizing it. And at the moment it's a bit like the story. We're kind of dealing with a monster and trying to control it.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of like the ideal that a lot of people would wish for. Like Brecht had this relationship with the designer, and Peter Brook wanted the design to be evolving during rehearsals, but you do need long rehearsal periods and money for that, don't you? It is an expensive way of working.
It is an expensive way of working, and it's getting increasingly difficult. But we'll keep battling forward, as it were.
Yeah, a lot of theatres seem to be cutting back on producing. There are a lot of co-productions at the moment, or some theatres are doing mostly hosting companies like yours. How have you found it? Has that been an advantage to you in any ways, or is it still hard for you?
It's always hard, but we've been so lucky having this relationship with Leeds Playhouse. This is the third or fourth co-production of some kind or another. And even when we made Macbeth, which wasn't a co-production because they had produced their own Macbeth, which is also on, I think in 3 or 4 weeks' time, they're bringing it back. So it wasn't appropriate that our Macbeth and their Macbeth sat next to each other, but they allowed us to rehearse in here. And that is like extraordinary. We're so grateful, and it's such an amazing opportunity for us, because we have this really great space which suits our work. There's an amazing infrastructure behind it. They've got technical people, set builders, production people that are always with their hands away supporting what we do. And it saves us a huge amount of money, but it gives us the time and space that we can do this exploration to create what we make. And it's always a bit risky what we do, because we always think it's going to work, but we don't know how well it's going to work. Because you could always just, you could always stage it more conventionally. And we all know the rules of that to a certain extent. And yet, when we try these other ways, we're always slightly in the void on it. Does that mean we're dancing on the void of not knowing whether we're going to pull this off or not? And some critics are a bit varied about, I always think we give a good show, but, some people think, oh yeah, I know what's something really lacking there, or, but that's part of the process.
Yeah.
We are discovering as we explore. So
your process must have developed quite a bit over, and the technology must have changed as well over the years that you've been producing theatre.
Yeah, I mean, what's brilliant now is that the technology allows you almost immediate access to what you're trying to output. So you can sort of grab video material or make it so we were exploring whether we could. With one of these TVs, it's like a chest of drawers. So you turn it around, and it's got a TV in it. So if it looks like you put your hand behind the back of the chest of drawers, you can see a different kind of arm appear. So we can, with our phone, quickly go and take a film of the actor's arm, and within 2 minutes, we can be putting the film arm into the TV. Now, when we first started to explore this kind of technology, I'm thinking back now to 2006, 2007, we would have had to render it. We would have had to, transpose it. It would have taken half the day just to get that. So now we can live mix the sound, the image, sample. We can, James can be creating soundtrack so I can hear it. And I can say, oh, that works, or that doesn't, or we can negotiate it. It's an organic, much quicker process than it was even 10 years ago, 15 years ago. In our first sort of video shows, we had to put it all on DVD, and then that would become the master, cut, as it were. And then if you wanted to change it, you'd have to re-render it all night and then try again the next morning. And very slow. And it meant you couldn't change much. So even when you knew it wasn't quite working, you had to kind of live with it. Whereas now you can very quickly change and adapt and work with the material.
I suppose that puts you under pressure to push the technology a bit further. When people are sat in the audience thinking, well, I could do that on my phone, you want to push it to something that they can't do, I suppose, would you?
Yeah, you do. But I mean, that's the kind of, for me, I suppose, as someone who's trying to sort of pull all these strands together. I mean, it's also a bit like the novel. The novel is the novel is a bit of a mess, really. It's why it doesn't really adapt well to conventional, the conventional adaptation of Frankenstein to tell the story as it was written is often a bit unwieldy. I'm thinking of the Kenneth Branagh one and, the Robert De Niro as the creature, because it's a bit, all the strands don't really connect. That some of the plot is not particularly, you're not reading it for the reality of the plot. There's too many coincidences. But so there's a kind of struggle to tell the story. You can feel Mary Shelley struggling to get all these strands to somehow cohere. And I think that theatre is always a bit of a struggle, especially if you're really trying to explore something. If you're not just telling the story, but trying to get your hands in the blood and guts of it, then it's always a bit of a kind of tearing out something and trying to bring it together. And audiences, if they want a really clean experience, then I think this will be a slightly blood and gutsy, not in terms of content, but in terms of structure. It will. So one of the things we've got in here, we've got a kind of dance movement element to it, which allows me to transition between a lot of these two worlds. So that the real trick when you've got sort of two threads running parallel together is they run parallel and then they start to bleed into each other. Then you think, yeah, it's beginning to work, and the movement it's allowing me to do that at the moment. So I've got a really great choreographer, Casper Dillon, who's from Belgium, but I haven't worked with a choreographer for years. So, I'm dealing with that as well, which is a really great challenge. But yeah, it's bringing the strands together, and it's allowing the technology and the script and all the elements and the mess of the novel as well. I've tried to clean the novel up as much as possible. I've pared it down to a story that can be told within the time we've gotten with the two people. What I didn't want to do was have a show where, we call it the hat show, where you've got so many characters, and two people are all wearing different hats. I didn't think that could work, really.
Yeah, that's always the challenge of adapting a novel. You can get a lot more into a novel than you can in 90 minutes or 2 hours in stage time, and you've got to try and you don't want it to sort of be jumping and do a little bit of that scene, a little bit of that scene. You've got to try and find a thread. It's very different, isn't it? Yeah,
and that's, if I'm really, I think it's going to work. My instinct is saying it's going to work, but I won't know until first. I suspect I'll know in the final production week when we're running it, because it's all about how the music and how the light and how the video and how the actors all interconnect with this. It's a really hard process for the performers, because we've never worked with these two young performers before. They're great, but they're very used to sort of, you do the basically blocking and staging, and then in the final few days all this other stuff comes on top of them, whereas they're working with all this other stuff right from day one. I can sometimes see them looking like they're in the headlights of a very fast-moving lorry that's coming towards them.
It must be more fun, though, having all these things to play with all the way through rehearsals.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it's just you're always having to juggle, like juggling with making the light make sense, making the music make sense, all these sort of elements, the storytelling, and yet giving the actors time so that they can make sense of the script and where they are in space and time.
Yeah.
And I was saying this to Simon Wainwright, who's co-artistic director on this show. Normally, we don't have too many places for performers to hide, but there's always a little bit of space for them. With two, there's nowhere. They're on all the time. They're having to dance, having to act, having to move cabinets and be at the right place for the light and the projection. It's a lot of information they're having to deal with at any particular moment.
Yeah. I mean, it is quite a challenge for actors to be doing a two-hander, even without all the technology, isn't it? If they haven't done that before, it's a lot of pressure on them when they're on stage all the time with just two people.
Yeah, and of course they've been trained and to sort of deal with the psychology of their characters or of the timeline through the piece. And, in that psychology, they're not having to worry about lights and projection and all those other elements, because that should be kind of draped around them, and they don't. But here, the imitating the dog actor always have to have one part of their brain thinking about the technology So like a film actor is always thinking about their mark, where they are on the stage or where they are in the cinema space in relationship to the camera. So film acting, and I'm saying this to one of the actors at the moment a lot, think of it like film. Yeah. Don't think of it like theatre. Think of it like film, and it will help you to internalize and to deal with the space slightly differently.
Yeah. And I suppose that hitting the mark and being in the right place at the right time, it's just as essential, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. There's a technical element on our stage that always is orientating the space where they are. So it might be very natural that in a kind of a classically realist play that you'd be much closer to each other. But here, it might be better to put them further apart and allow that tension to be across the script and the music and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I notice you're visiting a couple of venues in Switzerland as well.
Yeah.
How is international touring at the moment, post-COVID and post-Brexit? Is it more of a challenge than it used to be?
Well, it's definitely more of a challenge. We used to do a lot of work in Italy at an amazing opera house in Ancona, which also had a set of other venues. They're going through huge financial realignments, let's call it that. So, and we used to do a lot with the British Council, which have also, to a certain extent, now lost that kind of international touring infrastructure. So it's much more based on language teaching. So there's two areas that we used to do a great deal of work. Switzerland is really interesting because we've established a sort of connection with Switzerland with two or three venues there, which this will be the third time in 3 years that we've gone to these particular venues. And we build up an audience there, especially like in Winterthur, which is just outside Zurich, a really exciting young audience, I would say between 16 and 20. So they're learning English, but I think what they like about us is that our shows aren't conventional. They're kind of visual, fast storytelling. This one is slightly slower, actually, not quite like that. But and so I think the younger audience really likes that. They're used to that kind of screen-based visual way of putting a story together. So when we play in Winterthur, we've been playing to 700 or 800 people, which is full of these, younger people who are obviously very excited about what they see. So I get a sense, perhaps, when they're not seeing us, they're seeing more conventional types of theatrical expression. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I mean, I still go to theatre a lot and see a lot of conventional theatre, and it's really great. It's just not what we do. I saw Oliver here. It's brilliant, actually. It's brilliant. Loved it. Yeah, so there is that we're building that audience. But it is much harder to tour on the continent now. And Brexit hasn't made it any easier. And on one level, it's partly so much more expensive because you have to create these carnets and you have to create these to leave the country with set and objects. You have to, it's much harder now because you're kind of importing and then exporting again. So it's not easy. The whole landscape at the moment feels fragile. The whole theatre landscape feels fragile. I'm not being a pessimist about it. I think it will improve, but it's not easy for anybody, I get a sense.
Yeah. So when you're approaching theatres to book tours, do you get a feeling that they are a bit more reluctant or a bit more questioning about what's going to go in?
Yeah, I think very, very naturally they're worrying about, well, who's going to come and see it? So what's the title? What's the kind of way into a story? You see a lot at the moment of set texts, how many Macbeths are knocking around at the moment, Romeo and Juliet's, Lord of the Flies, they're drawing on school audiences. So you can, and then you've got a lot of musicals, a lot of, you can see that the broader industry is not got confidence that it can take risks in the same way it might have done 5 or 6 years ago. And of course, costs have gone up so much. Just the costs of everything, travel, accommodation, all that cost of living, it floats back into your production in ways that you can't imagine. It's really interesting, actually.
Yeah.
The cost of touring a show like this 6 years ago, would be pre-COVID 5 years ago. It's gone up a lot.
Yeah, even like the cost of turning the electricity on to light and heat the theatre.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. Petrol, all those kind. I mean, petrol's sort of gone down recently a little bit, but it's probably gone up a lot. But hiring a wagon to take your set, all that, you understand they need more money and they need more. It all adds up again. So yeah, and not to complain. It's not, we're very lucky. We're funded by the Arts Council. We've got a national portfolio and it's great support. But those levels of funding stay the same over. We got funding in 2018 and now it's 2024. I haven't really had an uplift, but that nobody has, unless they got awarded one in the last round. So in effect, your funding has stayed the same and your costs have gone up. So that's basically a loss. So you're having to always to sculpt what you do around those parameters. And then it's always a risk when you tour. Are we going to sell any tickets?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And how many? Macbeth did really well actually for us. It was a big hit for audiences. Frankenstein feels. I mean, Macbeth's a play, so people can come and see our version, and it's a play, and you can like it or not like it, but you do get quite a lot of Shakespeare's Macbeth. A novel translated into a play is not the same thing. So there's always. People say, you've got a great title. Well, yeah, but people want to read the novel if they're studying it. Seeing a play adaptation of it is possibly not what they want. And our version is, it's not going to be rock solid compared to the novel. It just never would be. It's always going to be an entanglement with a novel.
Right. I was wondering, actually, if there was an appeal to education to schools for Frankenstein or for your style, because I know a lot of drama teachers like a slightly unconventional style. They like certain theatre companies. I wonder if there is a following amongst drama teachers for imitating the dog.
Yeah, there definitely is. We've done a lot of workshops with drama teachers over the years to sort of show them that you don't have to spend a lot of money on this technology, that you can use phones and you can use the kind of equipment that you would have in a school to explore a different way of storytelling. I would like to think that schools' audiences would be interested in our adaptation, because I think a lot of our adaptations are, as I said before, encounters with the written material, the novel. And I don't know how, I still love reading novels. And I always think when I'm reading a novel, I kind of get immersed in the world of the novel. Then I'm also thinking, well, why am I affected by this? How is it connecting to my life? So in a sense, I'm always losing myself in the metaphors and the analogies and the language of the novel to trying to think, oh yeah, this novel's really about this or really about that. And it was interesting that in the Mary Shelley, I'd read it at university years ago because I had to study it because I did a module on Gothic literature. And I don't remember thinking it was that great, actually. I remember quite liking it, but I didn't think it. And then when I had to do the research and everything for this, I've really discovered, wow, this novel's got so much about the modern world, so much about birth and death and gender and climate change. And it's got all these things that feel really, really relevant. But you kind of have to dig around to make the connections because it's a sprawling novel. It's not easy because you have to, you've got all these different narratives and narrators sort of talking. And I think our work is an attempt to find those threads and bring them together as a live exploration in the space, rather than just simply telling a story. It's like saying, okay, how do we deal with this story? How do we get our hands, as I said before, how do we get our hands in the blood and guts of it again? And I think younger audiences like that because that's their struggle as well. I think, look, everybody, when they come to Mary Shelley's original novel is having to encounter the language which it was written in, which is not how we speak now. So straight away, you're having to kind of grapple with this language. And I've tried to capture that. I've tried to keep some of that original language back in it and not modernize it entirely, but actually give that language and the way she was trying to describe the world a kind of life of its own.
Yeah.
So I think I hope a younger audience gets that. So for me, it's a bit like watching, music's a real big influence for me. So sometimes I like going back, like the Beatles, and really watching what they were like and old bits of YouTube footage, and you can sort of see the crudity of certain types of instruments or instrumentation, but you can also see what they were doing as a set of musicians. So it's a bit like a foreign language compared to the kind of fact that now it's all done in the studio and mixed and everything. It's not. It's a much more live kind of sonic experience. And sometimes it sounds pretty terrible if you see the live concerts, but you see their performance battling through that. There's a brilliant one of them performing in New York, I think, and the sound is terrible. But I think going back to the novel's a bit like that. It's a bit like watching a Beatles concert from another era, but you know how music works now. You know how literature and storytelling works, and therefore you can sort of really still admire it and sort of take from it that this was the start of something musically really very important, that I can see the resonances of it now. And it's the same with the novel. And that kind of looking at this thing from afar and long ago, and then making the connection is what creates the drama, or for the younger audience, I think it kind of brings it. You're hoping to kind of not drag them, but open doors for them into this other way of seeing the world, which is still really relevant.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at something that's 200 years old, it's over 200 years old, amazingly, and it's been popular all that time. One question that you often ask is, well, what is it that's made it relevant for 200 years? But that might not be the same thing over those 200 years. Just like when you watch Hamlet as an 18-year-old and then you watch it as a 40-year-old, it seems like a different play because it means something different to you. Somebody in the early 19th century reading Frankenstein would probably see it as a completely different novel as we would see it now, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So every generation brings its own interpretation to any work of literature. And you can see that in theatre adaptations of, think of all the versions of Hamlet, that have been on, from, Jonathan Pryce's, where he's possessed by the ghosts, which I remember seeing as, I think a teenager, and it never left me that. And I think I saw the Michael Pennington Hamlet, which is much more traditional, but kind of also quite stark, So, and you think of Laurence Olivier's Hamlet, just, 1947 or 1948, just after the Second World War. Same play, it's so different, And I think, there'll be lots more adaptations of Frankenstein. This will just be one amongst many over the decades. But hopefully it'll be one that people remember and think that was really interesting and it engaged me for the period of time that I was in the theatre. That's all you want, isn't it? To be touched and moved and excited.
That was Andrew Quick, co-creator of Frankenstein for Imitating the Dog, featuring design by Hayley Brindle, lighting by Andrew Crofts, and original music by James Hamilton. The production will open at Leeds Playhouse from the 15th of February 2024, before touring to Oxford Playhouse, Watford Palace Theatre, the Lowry in Salford, Cast in Doncaster, Mercury Theatre in Colchester, Liverpool Playhouse, and the Dukes Lancaster. For more information, see www.imitatingthedog.co.uk or www.leedsplayhouse.org.uk.
You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.